The arrow came out of nowhere. One second the king was riding tall on his horse, laughing at something one of his lords had said, and the next second, Amara had thrown herself sideways into him, pulling them both out of the saddle and into the hard dirt. The arrow buried itself in the thick oak tree behind where he had been sitting, just a breath before. Silence swallowed the entire hunting party. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Amara got up first. She pressed one knee into the ground, scanned the tree line with her dark eyes, and already knew the direction the arrow had come from, the distance, and how many minutes ago the person had been standing there. She knew because she had been trained to know. She had been trained to notice everything that everyone else chose to ignore. That was her entire life, summed up in one small moment. She had grown up in the back end of the royal kennels of Kavari, in a land where the sun baked the soil red, and the dry season cracked the earth like old pottery. The kennel master who raised her was a quiet man named Gareth, a man with rough hands and a gentle voice, who found her wrapped in a torn cloth near the kennel gate the morning after a border raid took her family. He did not bring her inside the palace. He brought her into the kennels, because that was where he lived, and that was the kindest thing anyone would do for an orphaned girl with no name and no blood worth mentioning at court. Gareth gave her the name Amara, which in the old tongue meant steady, and steady she was from the very beginning. She did not cry the way other children cried. She watched, she listened. She learned the moods of each hound the way other children learned letters. She understood that the old gray hound in the corner pen barked only when strangers carried iron, not wood. She noticed that the spotted female near the gate always lay down facing south before a rainstorm hit. She absorbed everything, quietly, without being told to, and without expecting praise for it. Gareth saw this in her, and shaped it carefully. He taught her tracking the way some fathers teach their sons to fish, patiently, in the early morning light, out in the tall grass beyond the royal walls. He showed her how to read a broken twig, how to measure a footprint, how to smell the difference between the sweat of a man who was afraid and the sweat of a man who was simply warm. He told her that these skills were worth more than gold if she used them well, and worth nothing if she let pride turn them into performance. She listened to every word. By the time Amara was 12, she could track a deer through rocky ground for 2 days and return with it. By 14, she could tell a lord's horse from a stable boy's horse by the depth of the print alone. By 16, Gareth began sending her ahead of the royal hunting parties to check the path, to make sure the trails were safe, to mark the spots where game was plentiful. She worked without complaint, ahead of the group, usually alone, usually unseen. That was how the lords and ladies of Kavari first began to speak of her, if they spoke of her at all. Not as a girl, not even as a person, really, just as a function. The tracker who runs ahead, the kennel girl who checks the path. And then, because cruelty is lazy and prefers one name above many, they settled on something simpler. They called her the Hound. It started with Lord Clarence, a wide man with a red face, who had never once tracked anything in his life, and yet spoke about hunting the way a drunk man speaks about swimming, loudly and without skill. He had watched Amara move through the bush once, low and quick and silent, her nose turned toward the wind, her eyes reading the ground, and he laughed and said to the man beside him, "Look at her. She moves just like one of Gareth's hounds." The other man laughed too. The name passed around the camp that night like a cup of wine, and by morning it had stuck. Nobody corrected it. Nobody stepped forward to say this was unkind, or that the girl had a name, or that she had likely saved 3 hunting parties from injury through her work. Gareth heard it, and his jaw tightened, but he said nothing to Amara directly. He simply handed her a longer knife that evening, and said, "You are ready for the hard trails now." It was his way of saying he was proud of her. Amara heard the name. She heard everything. She let it sit in her chest for one night, felt the weight of it, and then set it aside the next morning, the same way she set aside a dull knife, with the intention of finding something sharper. She had work to do. She did not have time for the opinions of people who could not tell north from south without a herald pointing the way. The noble daughters who came to the palace that season did not know what to make of her at all. They arrived in silk and perfume, each one of them carrying a quiet ambition wrapped in a warm smile. The king, Zuberi, had only recently been crowned after his father's death, left the throne in young hands, and the court was loud with the sound of families angling for position. Every lord with a daughter of marrying age had packed her into a carriage and made the journey to Kavari's capital, dressed her in her finest, and pointed her toward the palace like a well-aimed arrow. Lady Ndara was the most obvious of them. She was the daughter of Chancellor Obasi, the man who had run the kingdom's day-to-day business for 15 years and considered himself the real backbone of the throne. Ndara was polished in the way that expensive furniture is polished. You could see your reflection in her, but she was cold to the touch. She smiled at everything and trusted nothing, and she moved through the palace the way her father moved through council meetings, always knowing which seat had the best view of the door. Dara had noticed Amara once, in passing, near the kennel gate. She had wrinkled her nose and said nothing, which was worse than an insult because it meant Amara was not even worth the breath. It was Lady Nandara's attendant who had laughed and whispered the word hound loud enough for Amara to hear as they walked away, their skirts sweeping the dust Amara had just walked through. Amara had said nothing. She had turned back toward the kennels and fed the hounds their evening meal, measuring each portion with care, the way Gareth had taught her. But she was not made of stone. Nobody is. There were nights when she sat at the edge of the kennel roof, looking up at the palace lights, and felt the sharp bite of something she had no clean word for. It was not jealousy, exactly, because she did not want the silk, or the candles, or the dinners. It was something closer to grief, a quiet mourning for the fact that a person could work hard, and be loyal, and be skilled, and still be invisible, still be nothing, still be a hound. She never cried about it, but she felt it, and feeling it made her sharper. She fed the hounds before herself each morning, not because anyone made her, but because Gareth had told her once that the measure of a person is what they do when no one is watching. The hounds depended on her. She did not let them down. It was the same quiet loyalty she brought to everything, the same steady heart that Gareth had named her for. She was still that girl on the morning of the royal hunt. She was ahead of the party, as always, checking the eastern trail, when something made her stop. It was not a sound, it was an absence of sound. Birds that should have been calling were silent. The undergrowth to the left was too still, not the stillness of empty space, but the stillness of something waiting. She dropped low without thinking. Her hand went to her knife. She scanned the tree line slowly, the way Gareth had taught her, not looking for the thing itself, but for the shadow of the thing, for the negative space it created in the world around it. She found it, a figure, pressed against an oak 40 yards into the trees, downwind, holding something long and narrow across one arm. She read the angle of the arm and already knew where it was pointed. She looked back at the trail behind her, at the king's horse emerging from the bend in the path, at the way King Zuberi was laughing at something, relaxed and unaware, sitting exactly in the place where the arrow would go. She was already moving before the thought was fully formed. She hit him hard enough to knock the breath from them both. They went down in the dirt together, the arrow singing through the air just above them, and burying itself in the wood behind. Amara rolled, came up on one knee, and faced the tree line. The figure was already gone, running, and she memorized everything about the way it moved before it disappeared into the deep bush. Then silence. Then the sound of the hunting party catching up, shouting, horses pulling up short, lords falling over each other with useless questions. Amara stayed where she was, on one knee, reading the forest. She did not look at the king. She did not perform. But Zuberi looked at her. He was sitting up in the dust, his ceremonial riding coat dirty, his crown slightly tilted, and he was looking at her the way you look at something you have always walked past, and only now, in the right light, finally seen. He pushed himself to his feet without accepting the hands that rushed to help him, walked the few steps between them, and crouched down to her level. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Amara blinked. It was not the question she expected. "No," she said. "What is your name?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "They call me the Hound," she said, because that was the truth. Zuberi looked back at the arrow in the tree. Then he looked back at her. "That is not a name," he said. "What is your name?" The question was so simple and so direct that something in her chest cracked, just slightly, like ice at the end of winter. Not enough to break through, just enough to let a little light in. "Amara," she said. "My name is Amara." He nodded, as though he was committing it to memory. "Amara," he said. "Thank you." The lords around them were talking loudly. already beginning to shape the story into something that placed them at the center of it. None of them had moved fast enough to matter. None of them had read the forest. None of them had even known there was danger until the arrow had already passed. But King Zuberi knew, and King Zuberi remembered a name. That evening, back inside the palace walls, the noble daughters gathered in their usual cluster near the long garden hall, comparing what they had heard. Lady Nandara listened with a small, careful smile and said nothing meaningful. Lord Clarence was telling anyone who would listen that he had sensed danger before the girl had even acted. The court was performing itself, the way it always did. Amara was in the kennels, feeding the hounds their evening meal, measuring each portion with care. Gareth sat beside her on the low bench and looked at the same hounds she was looking at, and after a long quiet he said, "You did a good thing today." "I did the job," she said. "Yes," Gareth said, "but you did it for the right reasons." She did not answer that. She just kept working. But she thought about the way the king had looked at her. Not like she was a tool, not like she was beneath him, just like a person. Like she was simply and plainly a person who had done something real in the world. She thought about that for a long time after the lamps went out. The hounds slept easy that night. Amara listened to them breathe and looked at the ceiling and felt something she did not have a name for yet, something that sat in the chest differently than grief, lighter and more dangerous. Somewhere above her, in the palace proper, a king was thinking about a name he had not known before today. And in the shadows of the chancellor's private study, a man with careful eyes was already thinking about the girl who had saved the king, and what it might cost him if that girl was allowed to stay visible. The first morning after the hunt, King Zuberi sent a message to the kennels. It was not a formal message. It was not sealed with wax or carried by a herald in a fine uniform. It was a short note written in plain ink on plain paper, folded once, and carried by a young guard who looked embarrassed to be delivering something so simple to a place that smelled of hounds. The note said, "I would like the tracker to accompany my morning ride, if she is willing." Amara read it twice. She looked at Gareth. Gareth looked at the ceiling, then back at her, and said only, "Go." She went. It became a pattern so quietly that nobody could name the exact moment it started. The king rode early, before the court was properly awake, before the noise and the ceremony settled into the palace halls. Amara rode beside him, not behind him, which was the first thing that made the stable boys stare at each other in the pale morning light. She was not there as a servant. She was not performing a duty in the formal sense. She was simply there, and the king seemed to want her there, and so she went. They did not talk about the arrow, not directly, not at first. They talked about easier things. Zuberi asked about the hounds, about how she read the land, about what she noticed that others missed. He asked the questions with real interest, not the thin, polite interest that noblemen used when they felt obligated to speak to someone beneath them, but the heavy, genuine interest of someone who actually wanted to know the answers. And Amara answered him honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer anything. She told him that most people look at the world, but they do not read it. They see the surface, but they never ask what is underneath. She told him that a broken twig tells a story if you know how to listen, that the smell of fear is different from the smell of sweat, that silence can be louder than noise if you understand what the silence is replacing. She told him these things plainly, without dressing them up, the way Gareth had always spoken to her. Zuberi listened the way that good leaders listen, with his whole attention, without filling the silence with his own voice. "You trust the land more than you trust people," he said one morning, not as a criticism, just as an observation. Amara thought about it. "The land does not pretend," she said. Zuberi was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Neither do you, I think." She did not respond to that, but she felt it land. Those early rides were watched, of course. Everything in a palace is watched. The grooms talk to the maids talk to the attendants, and the attendants talk to the noble daughters. And by the time the news had traveled from the stables to the upper rooms, it had already been shaped and reshaped by each pair of hands it passed through. The story the noble daughters heard was that the king had developed an odd interest in his kennel girl, which was probably a phase, probably born of gratitude for the hunt, probably nothing to worry about. Lady Nothing to worried about it anyway. She said nothing, which was her particular skill. Nindara had learned from her father that words spoken too early are weapons given to the enemy. She watched. She smiled when the king entered a room and stood where she could be seen, and she made careful notes in her private mind about the way Zuberi's eyes moved when he came in from his morning rides. He was lighter. That was the word Ndara settled on. He came back from those mornings lighter, as though something heavy had been lifted from him, out there in the open air. She did not like that at all. Lord Clarence had no such patience for careful watching. He simply said, loudly, at a dinner table with 8 other lords, that it was embarrassing for a king to spend his mornings talking to a kennel worker when there were proper ladies available to him. The table made agreeable noises. Someone mentioned that the girl did not even know how to hold a fork correctly, which was both possibly true and completely beside the point. None of this reached Amara directly. She lived in the kennels. She did not eat at those tables. But the palace had thin walls in the ways that mattered, and Gareth was old enough to hear things that were not meant for him, and he looked at Amara sometimes in the evenings with an expression she had learned to translate, "There is noise coming. Be ready." She was always ready. What nobody noticed, because nobody was paying attention to the right things, was that Amara herself was still reading the land. She was still doing her actual work, still checking the trails, still tracking the game routes before the hunting parties went out. And she was noticing something else, something that did not fit, a pattern in the landscape around the palace that had not been there before. First strangers had been near the eastern wall, not one stranger, not a wandering traveler, several people, on different days, approaching from the same direction, stopping at the same distance from the wall, and leaving. She found their tracks in the soft earth near the creek. She found a torn piece of cloth on a low branch that matched nothing worn by any worker she had ever seen near the palace grounds. She found a small pile of stones arranged in a pattern near the old gatekeeper's well, the kind of arrangement that was not accidental. She said nothing yet. She was not certain of enough to speak, and she knew that an unsupported claim from the kennel girl would be laughed out of any room in the palace before it reached the king's ears. So she kept looking. Meanwhile, the mornings continued. In the 7th week of their rides, Zuberi told her something she had not expected. They were stopped at the top of the eastern rise, looking down at the valley where the city spread out below the palace walls. And he said without turning his head, "My father told me the day before he died that the hardest thing about being a king is that everyone around you has a reason to want something from you." He said it was nearly impossible to know if anyone near you was truly honest or simply skilled at looking honest. Amara looked at the city below. "What did you tell him?" "I was too young to tell him anything useful," Zuberi said. "I just listened." "That was the right thing to do," she said. He turned and looked at her then. "Do you know why I ask you to come on these rides?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I do not want anything from you," she said. Zuberi looked back at the city. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly it." There was a kind of sadness in his voice when he said it. The loneliness of a man, surrounded by people who could not stop performing long enough to simply be present. Amara understood that loneliness in her own way. She had lived inside a version of it for years. Invisible people and important people are lonely for different reasons, but the shape of the feeling is surprisingly similar. She did not say that. She just sat with him in the quiet for a while, and they both looked at the city, and neither of them needed to fill the silence. Inside the palace, Chancellor Obasi was filling his own silences with careful planning. He was a tall man, not old, but aged, the way men go when they have spent too many years in rooms where the light is not quite right. He had served the previous king for 15 years and considered himself indispensable, which was accurate enough that it had become a kind of danger. When the old king died and the young king took the throne, Obasi had adjusted smoothly. Zuberi was 22, and earnest and good, and Obasi had decades of experience managing good kings. Good kings were easy. They wanted to believe the best of their advisors. They trusted the information they were given. They were grateful for the work that older, more experienced hands did quietly in the background. Obasi had planned the betrothal between Zuberi and Ndara for almost a year before the old king even fell ill. It was not a romantic plan. It was a political one, clean and efficient. Ndara on the throne meant the chancellor's hand stayed on the real machinery of the kingdom. It was what Obasi had worked toward his whole career, and it was very close now. The betrothal had been discussed in council. The timing had been agreed upon. All that remained was the formal announcement. And then a kennel girl had shoved the king out of the way of an arrow, and the king had started spending his mornings talking to her. And something in Obasi's careful plan had developed a small crack. He looked at the crack the way a man looks at a crack in a wall he has just finished building, with a very particular kind of irritation. Ndara came to her father's study one evening, without being summoned, which was unusual. She sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap and said, "The king is becoming attached." Obasi already knew. "It will pass," he said. "What if it does not?" Ndara asked. Obasi looked at his daughter with a complicated expression, the expression of a man who is proud of what he has built, but occasionally unsettled by how much she resembles him. "Then we will make sure it passes," he said. Nodded. She stood, smoothed her dress, and left without another word. That was the evening. Obasi began to think seriously about the kennel girl. Not as a person, because he was not in the habit of thinking about people in the lower quarters as persons, but as a problem. And problems, in Obasi's experience, were simply puzzles waiting for the right solution. He began to ask quiet questions. He called in small favors. He listened to the right servants at the right hours. He learned that Amara was trusted near the royal quarters because of her work as a tracker. He learned that she had access to areas of the palace grounds that few others used. And he learned, from a guard who owed him a debt, that nobody watched the kennel girl because nobody thought she was worth watching. That was the opening. Obasi did not move quickly. He moved the way he always moved, slowly, precisely, leaving no obvious trace. He needed something that would remove the girl from the king's life in a way that could not be attributed to him, something that would appear to be the girl's own fault, something that the king would have no choice but to accept. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he made 2 decisions. The first decision he kept entirely to himself. The second decision was to accelerate the betrothal announcement before the king's attachment to the kennel girl had time to develop any further. He called a council meeting for the following week. Amara, who knew nothing of any of this, was out near the eastern wall again at dawn, crouching in the wet grass, reading a set of fresh tracts that had not been there the previous morning. Whoever was making these visits was getting closer. She pressed 2 fingers into the freshest print and measured its depth. Heavy. A grown man, or a man carrying something. She stood and looked toward the wall, and felt the familiar cold feeling she got when the land was telling her something she did not yet have enough pieces to understand. Something was coming. She could not say what, she could not say when, but the land did not lie, and the land was telling her clearly that the ground beneath the palace of Kavari was not as solid as it appeared. She walked back to the kennels in the early light, and fed the hounds their morning meal, measuring each portion with care, the way Gareth had taught her. She thought about the tracks. She thought about the torn cloth on the branch. She thought about the arranged stones near the old well. And she thought about a young king on a horse at the top of the eastern rise, looking down at his city with a kind of loneliness that no amount of ceremony could fill. She thought, "I need more pieces. I need to be certain. I cannot go to him with a feeling." The hounds finished their breakfast and looked at her with their calm, steady eyes. She thought, "But I need to be fast." The council meeting was called for a Tuesday. By Monday evening, word had moved through the palace, the way water moves through cracked stone. Quietly, unstoppably, finding every low place. The servants knew before the lords did. The ladies-in-waiting knew before the noble daughters did. And Lady Nainsara, who had been told nothing officially, walked the garden hall that evening with a particular stillness about her, the stillness of someone who already knows what tomorrow holds and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Amara did not attend council meetings. She was not invited to the palace's social dinners or its grand ceremonies. She lived at the edge of the palace world, close enough to see it clearly, far enough away that it rarely saw her back. But the kennel sat near the servants' corridor, and the servants' corridor ran along the back wall of the council hall, and sounds traveled in the early morning, when the walls were cool and the air was still. She was not trying to listen. She was feeding the hounds. But she heard the chancellor's voice through the stone, low and formal, and certain of itself. And she heard the words betrothal and namdara and announcement, and she heard the polite noise of agreement that a room makes when the most powerful man in it has already decided something and is only informing everyone else. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went back to measuring the hound food, because the hounds still needed their breakfast regardless of what was being decided in the rooms above her. Gareth found her on the bench outside the kennel gate an hour later. He sat beside her and said nothing for a while. She appreciated that about him. He had never been a man who covered difficult silences with useless words. Finally he said, "You heard." "Enough of it," she said. "It was always the plan," Gareth said. "Obasi has wanted that arrangement for a long time." Amara nodded. She looked at the palace wall. "The king does not look like a man who wants it," she said. Gareth was quiet. Then he said, carefully, "Amara, what are you feeling?" She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she did anything. "I am not sure that what I feel is the part that matters," she said. "What matters is what I know. And what I know is that the Eastern Trail has been walked by strangers for 3 weeks, and the stones near the old well are arranged in a signal pattern, and the arrow from the hunt did not come from a poacher." Gareth looked at her sharply. "I should have said it sooner," she said. "I wanted to be certain. I think I am certain now." "Then you need to go to the king," Gareth said. "The king is about to announce a betrothal," Amara said. "His chancellor has just finished arranging his future in a council meeting. I am a girl from the kennels with a story about footprints." "You are the girl who saved his life," Gareth said. Amara looked at him. "That is exactly the problem," she said. "Everyone who knows that story has decided what it means. The lords think it means the king owes me a kind word and nothing else. The chancellor thinks it means I am a complication. The noble daughters think it means I am reaching above myself. And the king—" She stopped. "And the king?" Gareth said quietly. "The king thinks it means he found someone honest," she said. "And I do not want to use that against him." Gareth was quiet for a long time. A hound pressed its head against Amara's knee, and she rested her hand on it without looking down. "Amara," Gareth said finally, "being honest with him about danger is not using anything against him, it is the job." She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, handed Gareth the empty food measure, and walked toward the palace entrance. The guard at the servants' gate knew her face and let her through without stopping her, which was either trust or habit, and either way she was grateful for it. She moved through the back corridors, the way she moved through the bush, quickly and without waste, already thinking through what she would say and how she would say it, without making it sound like the complaint of a girl who had just heard news she did not like. She reached the anteroom outside the king's private study and stopped. There were 2 guards there and a steward, and the steward looked at her with the particular expression that palace servants develop when they see someone who belongs to a lower part of the building in a higher part of the building. "The tracker," the steward said. "The king is occupied." "I know," Amara said. "I need 5 minutes." "I do not think." "Please tell him Amara is here," she said. "I think he will want to know." The steward weighed the name against the inconvenience and apparently decided the risk was low enough. He disappeared inside. Amara waited. The 2 guards did not look at her, which was a kindness of a kind. The steward came back. 5 minutes, he said, and held the door. Zuberi was standing when she came in, which surprised her. He was at the window, still in his council clothes, and he turned when she entered and looked at her with eyes that were trying to be unreadable and not entirely succeeding. He knew she had heard something. She could tell from the way he stood. She did not give him time to manage the moment. She simply told him what she knew. She told him about the tracks, starting 3 weeks ago and continuing to get closer. She told him about the cloth on the branch, the arranged stones near the old well, the fact that the arrow from the hunt had been precisely aimed at a specific angle that suggested the shooter had known the king's exact position before he arrived. She told him all of it plainly, without decoration, the way she told him about broken twigs and hound behavior, as evidence of a pattern that did not fit innocence. Zuberi listened without interrupting. His face changed several times while she talked, moving through things she could not fully name because she was concentrating on the words. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "Why did you wait to tell me this?" he said. "I wanted to be certain," she said, "and I was not certain until yesterday. And now you are certain?" "I am certain enough," she said. "I cannot bring you every piece, but what I can bring you is a direction. Whoever is circling the palace, they are not finished. The hunt was one attempt. There will be another." Zuberi looked at her for a long time. "Amara," he said, "why are you telling me this now? Today, of all days, she met his eyes. Because the timing is not mine to control, she said. The land does not wait for convenient moments. I tell you when I know. Something shifted in his expression. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and quieter. The look of a person who has been looking for something and suddenly found it, unexpectedly, in a place they were not thinking to look. He said, I need you to stay close to the palace, not in the kennels. I want you in the East Wing quarters. I want you watching. The council, she began. The council does not run my guard decisions, he said, and there was a tone in his voice she had not heard in their mornings together, the tone of the crown rather than the man. I am the king. I am asking you to do the job you are best at. Will you do it? Amara stood straight. Yes, she said. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. The announcement tomorrow, he said. She stopped, but did not turn around. It is not, he paused. It is complicated. That is not my business, she said. No, he said. But I want you to know, it is complicated. She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she did not know what to do with. She stored it quietly and kept moving. That night, Chancellor Obasi received a brief report from his man near the king's study. The report said that the kennel girl had been granted a private audience with the king and had been given quarters in the East Wing. Obasi sat with this for a long time. Then he summoned the guard who owed him a debt, and he asked him a question about access to the royal quarters. And the guard answered carefully, because the chancellor was the kind of man whose questions were never simple. The pieces of Obasi's plan shifted and rearranged. He had intended to move slowly, patient, as he always was. But patience, he reminded himself, was a tool, not a virtue. When circumstances changed, a smart man changed with them. The kennel girl was becoming visible in ways he had not expected. Visibility made her useful to the king, and dangerous to everything Obasi had built. He would need to move faster than he had planned. He looked at the small velvet pouch on the corner of his desk. Inside it were 2 pieces of jewelry, a golden ring and a brooch set with a dark stone, both bearing the royal crest, both taken from the palace treasury under an accounting excuse that would survive any casual review. He picked up the pouch. He turned it over in his hand. Then he called for his most trusted servant and gave her very specific instructions about where the pouch should be left before morning. Amara, in her new room in the East Wing, sat on the unfamiliar bed and listened to the palace settle around her. It smelled different here, the stone and lamp oil, and something floral she could not identify. The hounds were not nearby, and the silence felt wrong without them. She did not sleep for a long time. She thought about the tracks. She thought about the direction they were coming from, and she thought about who in the kingdom had reason and resources to want a young king removed from his throne, and she thought about the counsel she had heard through the wall, and she thought about the way Chancellor Obasi's voice sounded when he spoke in that room. Certain, settled. The voice of a man who believed the outcome was already known. A cold thought moved through her, very slowly, like a stone sinking in deep water. She had been thinking about the threat as something coming from outside the palace. But what if it was not coming from outside at all? She sat up in the dark and stayed very still, the way she stayed still in the bush when she needed to think without disturbance. She thought, the arrow was precisely aimed. Someone knew the route. Someone knew the position. She thought, the stones near the old well are signals, are sent to someone inside. She thought, I have been watching the wall. I should have been watching the rooms. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling. Above her, the palace was quiet. Below her, in the kennels, the hounds were sleeping. But somewhere in the same building, in a room she could not see, someone was awake and planning. And by morning, when the sun came up and the East Wing corridor was bright and full of the ordinary noise of a palace starting its day, a steward would find a velvet pouch containing 2 pieces of jewelry stamped with the royal crest, tucked beneath the mattress of the new East Wing occupant. And the entire shape of Amara's life was about to change in the worst possible way. She did not find the pouch. The steward found it. That was the precise and terrible calculation Obasi had made. Amara would have found it herself if she had been given the morning to move through her own space, because she was the kind of person who noticed everything. But Obasi's servant had left a quiet word with the head steward the previous evening, a vague word about keeping a careful eye on the new East Wing occupant. And so when the head steward came through the corridor at dawn to deliver fresh water and linens, he was already looking for something without knowing what. He pulled back the mattress out of habit or instruction and found the velvet pouch and opened it, and saw the royal crest on both pieces of jewelry, and went very pale. Amara was already awake when they came for her. She had been awake for most of the night. She heard the footsteps before the knock. 2 sets of boots, heavy, formal, the rhythm of guards rather than servants. She opened the door herself, which seemed to surprise them. The head steward was behind the guards, holding the velvet pouch with both hands like it was something he wanted to be visibly far away from. His face was the kind of blank that people produce when they are following a sequence of events they do not want to be part of. "The Lady Amara," one of the guards said. "There is no lady," Amara said. "Just Amara. You are required in the Great Hall," the guard said, "by order of the council." She looked at the pouch. She looked at the guards. She thought, very quickly and very clearly, this is not an accident. Then she stepped out of the doorway and walked with them, because fighting now would only make the story easier to believe. The Great Hall in the morning light held every person of consequence in the palace, or close enough to it. The lords who had been at the hunt were there. The noble daughters were there, standing in their careful groups, wearing expressions that were trying very hard to be appropriate concern, rather than something else. Lady Ndaso stood at her father's left side, and her face was genuinely blank, in the way that a thing that has been prepared for is blank. No surprise, just waiting. Chancellor Obasi stood in the center of the hall in his formal robes, and he wore the expression of a man who is deeply, sincerely reluctant to be here, which was the best performance Amara had seen in the palace so far. King Zuberi was seated at the end of the hall, on the raised platform where formal matters were heard. He was in his formal clothes, and his crown was straight, and his face was completely unreadable, which was different from the way he looked in the mornings, different enough that Amara noted it as data. He was being the king right now, not the man who had asked for her name in the dirt after an arrow nearly took his life, the king. She stood where she was placed, in the center of the hall, with the guards at either side. The velvet pouch was brought forward on a small tray, the charges were read, and they were plain and damning. Theft of royal property, the items found in her quarters, the presumption of the position taken in the East Wing abused for access. Amara listened to every word. She noted each one. Then Chancellor Obasi spoke, and his voice was the most difficult thing to hear, because it was perfectly calibrated, the exact tone of a man who is reluctantly doing his duty and wishing the circumstances were otherwise. He said that it was a painful matter, that the girl had been trusted with unusual access, that the trust appeared to have been misplaced. He said it slowly and clearly, so that every person in the room could hear not just the words, but the shape of what he was implying, the shape of a girl who had overreached, who had been given an inch and taken a yard, who had used the king's kindness for her own gain. Nobody spoke for her. The lords were still. Gerwin Gareth was not in the room. He would not have been admitted. Then, one of the council members turned to the king and said, "Your Majesty, the council's recommendation is banishment from the palace grounds, effective immediately." Zuberi looked at Amara. Amara looked back at him. She thought about the tracks near the eastern wall. She thought about the cold realization she had reached in the dark of last night. She thought about saying, "This is a trap." She thought about saying, "The Chancellor is hiding something, and the threat is inside the palace, and you are in danger." She thought about all of it, and she knew, with the clear-eyed honesty that had defined her entire life, that none of it would work in this room. Not right now. Not with the pouch on the tray and the council in agreement and Obasi's perfectly calibrated reluctance filling all the air. An accusation without evidence from the accused is not an accusation. It is a performance, and it would only make the story larger and more convincing. So she said one thing. She looked at the king and she said, clear and steady, loud enough for every person in the hall to hear, "A hound bites strangers, my king, never its own." Then she stopped talking. Zuberi held her gaze for a long time. Then he looked away. The judgment was pronounced. Banishment from the palace grounds, effective by sundown. She walked out of the great hall with her head straight, and her steps even, and her hands open at her sides, the way Gareth had always told her to move through spaces that were trying to make her small, like she belonged to herself, regardless of where she was standing. At the door she passed Lord Clarence, who was saying something quietly to another lord, and she did not look at him. She passed a cluster of ladies in waiting, and she did not look at them either. At the back of the group, near the edge, Lady Lord Jandra watched her leave. Amara looked at Nodder once, briefly, and Nodder looked back, and for 1/2 second the performance slipped, just slightly, just a fraction, just enough for Amara to read it the way she read tracks in the dirt. Satisfaction quickly covered. But there. Amara walked out into the corridor and kept walking. She went to the kennels first. She collected the small bundle of things that belonged to her, which was not many things: the long knife Gareth had given her, a rolled cloth for sleeping outside, the small carving of a hound that Gareth had made for her when she was 7, and had given her when she turned 18 as a kind of blessing. She put them in a cloth bag and stood in the middle of the kennel for a moment, looking at the hounds. They came to her one by one and pressed their noses against her hands, and she touched each of them in the particular way each one liked, and she said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Gareth appeared in the kennel doorway just before midday. He looked at her bag and looked at her face, and his jaw went tight, the way it did when he was holding something too large for his chest. "Amara." "It was planted," she said. "I know that," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I am not saying it so you will believe me. I am saying it because I need to say it once out loud before I go. It was planted, and I know who planted it, and I know why, and the king is not safe." Gareth crossed the kennel in 3 steps and held her shoulders the way a father holds a child before something hard. "Where will you go?" "Toward the eastern wall first," she said. "I need to follow a trail before it goes cold." Gareth looked at her for a long time. Then he let go of her shoulders and reached into his coat and pressed something into her hand. "Coins. Not many. Enough." "Come back," he said. "I will come back when I have something worth coming back with," she said. She left the palace grounds through the servants' gate as the sun began to slide toward the horizon, the bag over one shoulder, the long knife at her hip, and the cold piece of knowledge turning over in her mind. She did not look back at the palace as she went, not because she did not want to, but because looking back was a luxury she could not afford right now. She went east. At the tree line, she found the trail she had been tracking for 3 weeks, and this time she followed it properly, all the way to its source, without the constraint of palace walls or council meetings or velvet pouches on trays. It took most of the remaining afternoon. The trail led southeast, through the bush, past the creek, deeper into the dry forest than she had tracked before. It ended at a collection of old buildings that had once been a trading way station, long abandoned, or apparently abandoned, because there was smoke from the eastern window and 3 horses tied in the back, and the sound of voices from inside. Amara crouched in the long grass 50 yards out and listened. She listened for a long time, and when she had listened long enough to understand the shape of what was being planned, she felt something she had not felt in years, not since she was a small child in the kennels, and the torches outside had gone out during a storm, and the dark had been very complete and very heavy. She felt afraid. Not for herself, for the king, who was back inside the palace walls believing, perhaps, that the girl he had trusted had stolen from him. The betrothal feast was in 3 days. She needed to move faster than she had ever moved. She stayed in the bush for the rest of that first night, listening and noting, building the picture piece by piece, the way she had always built pictures, not by guessing at the whole, but by collecting each small part until the whole assembled itself. The men in the way station were not local. She could tell by their voices, the particular flatness of the accent that came from the northern territories, and by the way they moved, cautious and contained, like men who had learned their caution in harder places than Kavari's forests. There were 4 of them inside. A 5th came and went, always from the south, always on foot. She assumed the 5th was the one with palace access, the one who had placed the arranged stones near the old well, the one who had directed the arrow at the hunt. She did not know the 5th person's face, but she thought she understood who had given this 5th person their instructions. The plan she overheard in pieces and gaps was both simpler and more dangerous than she had expected. It was not a grand military scheme. It was a small, precise piece of poison, the kind that Obasi would have designed, because it required few hands and left no visible trace. The betrothal feast was to be the setting, the mechanism was a cup, specifically what went into it. The outcome was a new throne, with an empty seat and a chancellor who had been managing the kingdom's real business for 15 years, and would simply continue doing so through the grieving bride. Amara stayed in the grass until the fifth man made his next appearance, and she watched him arrive, and she looked at his face in the thin moonlight, and she recognized him. He was one of the palace guards, not one of the senior guards who appeared in important rooms. One of the quiet ones, the ones who stood at the back of corridors and opened doors and were never noticed. She had seen him near the east wing the previous morning. She had not thought about him, because she had not had enough pieces yet. She had the piece now. She waited until he left again, and then she waited longer to make sure she was not followed, and then she moved. She did not go back toward the palace gates. The order of banishment was in effect, and the guards would stop her, and a stopped Amara was a useless Amara. She went instead to the creek north of the estate, where she knew the old irrigation channel ran under the outer wall into the kitchen gardens. Gareth had shown it to her years ago as part of her tracking education, a lesson in how places that seem closed are never entirely closed if you know what to look for. The channel was narrow and wet and cold and entirely unpleasant. She went through it on her hands and knees in the dark with her bag held above her head, and came out in the kitchen garden smelling of mud and old water, which was the least of her concerns. She knew the back routes of the palace, the way she knew the back routes of the forest. She moved through them quickly and without hesitation, and she avoided every corridor that had light or sound, and she came at last to the one place she needed to reach, the room belonging to Gareth. She tapped twice on his shutter, the signal they had always used. A pause, then the shutter opened. Gareth looked at her, at the mud and the wet and the fact that she was back, and he said nothing at all for a moment. Then he opened the window wider, and she climbed through. She told him everything she had learned in the bush, quickly and quietly and in order, the way he had taught her to report, with the details in their proper sequence, no feeling first, just the facts in the shape they actually happened. Gareth listened with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the floor, nodding slightly now and then. When she finished, he looked up and said, "Oh, bossy." "Yes," she said. "And the guard, the one with palace access?" "His name is Edrin," Gareth said, before she could finish the question. "He has been on Obasi's household payroll for 2 years. I noticed it once in a ledger, and did not think enough of it. I should have." Amara filed that away. "I need to get to the king." "You are banished from the palace grounds," Gareth said. "I am currently inside the palace grounds," she said. "Covered in mud. I need to get to the king without going through any door that Edrin has access to, and I need to do it before the feast preparations begin, because once the kitchens are active and the cups are being handled, we lose the window." Gareth thought for exactly 4 seconds. Amara knew him well enough to count. Then he said, "The north garden stairs, they connect directly to the private corridor outside the king's personal chambers. Obasi does not use them because they are too exposed. No guard uses them because they lead nowhere anyone important wants to go. I will go first, and make sure the path is clear." Amara looked at him. "You should not risk yourself for this." "I have been risking myself for the things that matter since before you were walking," Gareth said, and he was already pulling on his coat. They moved through the palace in the dark and the quiet, Gareth in front, Amara a few steps behind, both of them moving the way long practice makes people move, without waste, without noise, reading the space ahead. The north garden stairs were cold and narrow, and spiraled up through a part of the wall that the palace architect had apparently considered purely structural. No lamps, no guards, just old stone, and the distant sound of the kitchen beginning its early work below. At the top, a short corridor. At the end of the corridor, a door. Gareth stopped at the foot of the door and looked at Amara. His expression said everything and nothing at once. She pressed his hand briefly, then stepped past him and knocked. The sound from inside told her the king was awake. It was very early, but she had suspected he would be. She had a feeling, built of nothing she could name, but solid enough to trust, that Zuberi had not slept cleanly in the last 2 days. The door opened. A guard, unfamiliar, looking at her with sharp eyes. "Amara," she said, "I need the king." "You are banished from." "I know what I am," she said. I need him to know what you do not know yet, please. Something in her voice, or her face, or the particular combination of mud and certainty she presented, made the guard hesitate. He closed the door partially, a murmur inside. Then the door opened again, wider. Zuberi stood in the doorway of his inner chamber in his plain mourning clothes, without the crown, without the ceremony. The man, not the king. He looked at her for a long time. His face was doing several things at once, things she could not fully read, which was unusual. You came back, he said. I told you I was not the threat, she said. I need you to listen to me, for as long as it takes to understand what I found. After that, do what you want with the information, but listen first. He stepped back from the door. She walked in. She told him everything again, cleanly and in order, the same way she had told Gareth, and she watched his face move through the story, with the same careful attention he brought to their morning conversations, the full weight of his attention on her words. She did not tell him how she had come to feel, in the darkest part of the previous night, lying in the cold grass outside the way station, a kind of furious grief about the fact that she had been thrown out of the palace on false evidence, while the real danger sat inside it, comfortable and careful. She did not tell him that. It was not the part that mattered. What mattered was the feast. What mattered was the cup. What mattered was Edrin the guard and the way station, in the southeast bush, and the 3 days remaining before the betrothal dinner. When she finished, the room was very still. Zuberi turned toward the window. He stood there for a long moment with his back to her. She could see the line of his shoulders and the way his hands hung at his sides. Then he said, quietly, I should not have let them take you out of this palace. Amara stood straight. That is not the part that matters right now, she said. He turned around. It matters to me, he said. She had no answer for that. Not a clean one, so she moved forward to the next thing, the way she always did with things she did not know how to hold. 3 days, she said. We need to find Edrin before he receives his next instruction. We need to document the trail from the way station. And we need to find out what Obasi actually knows, and whether Indara is involved, before anyone is publicly accused. Zuberi nodded. What do you need from me? Amara thought about it. Your trust, she said, and access to the eastern grounds without being stopped. Everything else I can manage myself. Zuberi looked at her. You have always had my trust, he said. I should have said so louder. She accepted that and moved on, because there was work to do, and the night was still dark, and 3 days was not very long, when the stakes were what they were. But somewhere in the back of her chest, in the place where she had stored that half-sentence from the king in the corridor 2 nights ago, it is complicated. Something small and stubborn began to uncomplicate itself. She did not sleep for the 2 days that followed. She did not notice the not sleeping the way other people notice it. She had learned years ago to run on less, to let the body do what the body could do and ask it for more, only when necessary. The next 48 hours were the necessary kind. Gareth remained in the palace, her connection to the inside. Zuberi moved with his usual schedule, so that nothing would alert Obasi, and Amara worked the ground between them, invisible in the way that people are invisible when they have spent their whole lives not being seen. She tracked Edrin first. She was good at this, watching without being watched, following a person through the spaces they thought were private. Edrin moved through the palace with the confidence of someone who believed the most dangerous work was already done. He visited the kitchens twice, in 2 days, under legitimate excuses, both times near the preparation area for the feast. She noted what he touched and what he did not touch, and she committed every detail to memory. On the second evening, she followed him out of the palace grounds through the eastern gate, using a route she had identified as his preferred one, and she tracked him southeast, toward the way station. He moved quickly. She moved quicker. When he reached the tree line and disappeared into the bush, she was already ahead of him, circling wide, and she positioned herself in the thick brush just beside the way station door before he arrived. She heard him enter. She heard the exchange, short and practical, instructions about timing, about the cup, about the signal to give when the moment came. She heard enough. Then she moved back through the dark, faster than she had moved in years, and she was back inside the kitchen garden channel before the moon had shifted much. Zuberi was waiting in Gareth's room when she returned. That surprised her. She had not expected him to be there. He was sitting on the bench by the window with Gareth, both of them quiet, and he stood when she came through the door. She told him what she had confirmed. She told him the timing, and the method, and the signal. She told him Edrin's face, and the number of men, and the direction of approach. Zuberi listened. Then he said, "I need you at the feast." "I am banished," she said. "I will deal with the banishment," he said. "I need you there because you know Edrin's face, and I need someone who can move through that room without anyone watching them." She thought about it. "If I appear at the feast, Obasi will know something has shifted. He may move earlier." "Yes," Zuberi said. "That is exactly what I want. I want him to show himself before the plan can be executed." Tayamara looked at him. "That is a dangerous strategy." "You told me the land does not wait for convenient moments," he said. "Neither do I." She almost said something. She stopped herself. "All right," she said. "I will be at the feast." The night before the betrothal dinner, she sat in Gareth's room and watched the lamp burn and thought about the shape of what was coming. She had run tracking operations before, smaller ones, personal ones, but always with the certainty that if she failed, the only consequence was to herself. This was different. The consequence here had a face and a name and a way of listening, with his full attention, that she had been trying not to think about too carefully. Gareth brought her tea at some point, and sat beside her, and said nothing. She appreciated it as much as she always had. Before dawn, she checked her knife, tied her hair back, and went over the floor plan of the great feast hall in her memory. The exits, the servant corridors, the position of the high table, the movement pattern of the cupbearers. She had watched enough feasts from outside to know the choreography. She was ready. The feast began at the 7th hour. Amara was inside the hall at the 6th hour, wearing servant's clothes that Gareth had found for her, standing near the wall in the shadow of the eastern column, with a serving tray that gave her reason to be still. The hall filled slowly with color and sound, lords and ladies taking their positions, the court musicians beginning their soft, steady background, the enormous table filling with food and flowers, and the particular glow of candle-lit ceremony. Chancellor Obasi arrived at the head of the room as though he had built the room himself, which in some ways he had. Mindara was beside him, composed and beautiful, and already looking at the high table where the king would sit. Every movement Mindara made was calibrated for observation. Amara watched her and thought, "She is performing certainty. She does not quite feel it." Zuberi entered last, as was custom, and the hall rose for him. He sat, and everyone sat, and the feast began. Amara scanned faces. She found Edrin in the 3rd minute, positioned near the east service entrance, in guard's clothes, with the same stillness she had seen in him at the way station. Not the stillness of comfort, the stillness of a man waiting for his moment. She kept her eyes on him, and her position near the column and the tray in her hands. The first course came and went. The second course, Zuberi performed the formal ease of a king at his own celebration, accepting the congratulations of his lords, raising his cup at the appropriate moments. He did not look at Amara. They had agreed he would not. Edrin moved at the 3rd course. He moved the way trained people move, without apparent hurry, drifting across the room in the servants' traffic, one hand carrying a cup that he had not been carrying before. Amara saw the cup. She noted the particular way he held it, protected, angled slightly inward, the way you hold something you do not want to spill. She moved. She moved through the feast the way she moved through the bush, using the crowd the way she used the grass, and she closed the distance between herself and Edrin in fewer seconds than she would have calculated as possible. And when she reached him, she stepped into his path directly, and the tray in her hands knocked the cup out of his, with a sound that was partly the crash of silver and partly her shoulder driving into his arm to make sure the cup went well clear of the table. The crash was loud enough. The room turned. Edrin looked at her, and his face changed through 3 expressions in the span of a breath: surprise, recognition, the particular and terrible realization that something has gone wrong, and then he did the thing she had expected. He ran. Or he tried to. The guards that Zuberi had positioned that afternoon, quietly and in plain clothes, stepped in from 3 directions. Edrin was stopped before he reached the service door. The cup was on the floor with its contents spreading across the stone, and in the terrible silence of the feast hall, Amara straightened and turned, and looked at the high table where Chancellor Obasi was sitting. Obasi was still. His face was doing nothing visible. He was, as always, performing. But his hands had flattened against the table in a way that was not the posture of a man who did not know what had just happened. Zuberi stood. The room was completely silent now. Even the musicians had stopped. Zuberi did not look at Obasi. He walked down from the high table to the floor of the hall, to the place where Amara was standing beside the spilled cup and the restrained guard, and he looked at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. It was the same question he had asked in the dirt after the arrow, the first day, and the echo of it moved through her chest. "No," she said, the same answer. He crouched beside the spilled cup without touching it, and looked at the contents spreading across the stone. And he looked at the guard held by his men, and he stood again. "Take him," he said, meaning the guard. Then he turned to face the hall, and his voice was different now, the crown fully on, the weight of it and the authority of it carried openly in each word. "Chancellor Obasi," he said. The room breathed. Obasi stood. His face had finally stopped performing and gone still, the deep still of a man who is calculating whether there is still a move remaining to him. "My king," Obasi said. "This is finished," Zuberi said. "All of it. My guards have documents from the way station in the eastern forest. They have been collected over the last 2 days, under my direct instruction. I have read them. I know what is in them." This was not entirely true. The documents had been collected that afternoon, and Zuberi had read the summary. But the statement served its function, which was to close every escape route before Obasi could see one. Obasi stood for 3 more seconds, then he sat down very slowly, and he folded his hands on the table, and he did not speak again. She did not move, she did not perform surprise. She sat beside her father's empty performance with her hands in her lap and her face carefully empty, and Amara, watching her, thought, she knew. She may not have known all of it, but she knew something. The feast hall was chaos and silence at the same time, the way rooms go when something enormous has happened, and nobody is quite certain yet what to do with their body. Lords spoke to each other in low, rapid voices. Ladies held still. The musicians had put their instruments down. Amara stood in the middle of all of it and felt the strange, disorienting stillness of a job completed. She had been running toward this for 3 days, without looking directly at what came after. Now it was after. Zuberi turned to her again, and this time the hall was watching them. "Amara," he said, clearly enough for the whole room. "My king," she said. "This kingdom owes you its king," he said, again. She did not know what to do with that, in front of all these people. She did not say anything. "I made an error," he said, "a significant one. I allowed a false story to remove from this palace a person whose loyalty and whose judgment were both beyond question. That error belongs to me, not to the council, not to the guards who followed orders. To me." The hall was completely silent now. "I am asking you to come home," he said. Amara stood in the servant's clothes, covered in the residue of 2 days of hard work and no sleep. And she looked at the king in his formal clothes in his formal hall, and she thought, for a moment, about all the names they had called her. Hound, Kennel Girl, the tracker who runs ahead. She thought about the velvet pouch and the cold cell of a judgment she had not been allowed to answer. She thought about the night in the grass outside the way station, when she had been afraid, not for herself, but for him. "I will come home," she said. And somewhere in the back of the hall, in the shadow of the western column, Lord Clarence was very quiet for a very long time. The formal council met 4 days later to assess the evidence against Chancellor Obasi. Amara did not attend that meeting either, not at first. She was not a lord. She held no official position. She was, as far as the palace records were concerned, still a member of the royal kennel staff, which meant she belonged to a category that did not attend formal council proceedings any more than the hounds themselves did. But she was in the palace. She was in the East Wing. And she had slept, finally, for 11 straight hours, the night after the feast, in a bed that smelled different from the kennels and had no hound pressed against her legs. And she had woken up to the strange and quiet fact that the thing she had been running toward had landed, and the kingdom was still standing, and the king was still alive. Gareth came to see her in the morning with tea. and a look on his face that was the closest thing to pride she had ever seen from him. And he sat with her in the quiet of the East Wing room and said, "The council is going to have a very long week." "Yes," she said. "What will you do?" he asked. She thought about it. "Feed the hounds," she said. "They have been without proper attention for 4 days." Gareth smiled. It was a rare thing, and she valued it. "After that?" he said. She looked out the window at the palace walls and the morning light on the stone, and she thought about after in a way she had not quite allowed herself before. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "I will figure it out." Gareth nodded. "That has always worked before," he said. She went to the kennels that morning and fed the hounds and checked each one carefully, and they pressed against her with the uncomplicated trust that had always felt more like home than any room in the palace proper. She measured each portion with care. She checked the old gray hound's paw, which had been a little stiff lately. She sat on the bench outside the kennel gate and let the morning sit on her for a while. The days that followed were full of official things she was mostly adjacent to, rather than inside of. The council met at Obasi, was formally removed from his position. Edrin and the men from the way station were in palace custody. The evidence was catalogued and reviewed, and the picture it painted was thorough enough that even Lord Clarence, who had been a supporter of the Chancellor, could not find a comfortable position to stand in. Zanara was a separate question. The evidence connected her to knowledge but not to action, and that was a distinction the council took seriously, as councils tend to, when the person in question is the daughter of the man they are trying. Amara had her own view on Nadara's involvement, but she kept it in the part of her mind she reserved for things she knew but could not prove, and she said nothing official on the matter. Zuberi asked her, one evening, in the private corridor outside the library where they had taken to talking because it was the closest thing to the open air of their morning rides, "What do you think about Nadara?" Amara thought about it. "I think she understood the direction her father was moving," she said. "I do not think she would have moved there herself." "Is that a defense of her?" he said. "It is what I observed," Amara said. "I do not make defenses, I make observations." Zuberi looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as him finding something both exasperating and exactly right. "You are the most precise person I have ever met," he said. "Gareth trained me to be precise," she said. "Gareth trained you to see clearly," he said. "The precision is you." She did not answer that. The mornings continued, and they were different now. Not different in the bad way, different the way that a trail looks different when you travel it in both directions. Familiar, but fuller. They rode the eastern rise again on the 5th morning, and looked down at the city the way they had before the hunt, before the arrow, before all of it. And the city looked the same from the outside, and different from the inside, the way things do when you have a better understanding of what they contain. Zuberi said, "I need to make an official appointment to the council." Amara looked at the city. "Someone to replace Obasi." "Yes, and someone to manage the eastern tracking and security routes. The person in that role should have experience, real experience, not the kind that comes from reading reports." She looked at him. "Are you asking me?" "I am asking you," he said. Amara thought about it for a long time. She thought about what it would mean to hold an official position, to be in rooms, to have her observations written down in ledgers and used in decisions. She thought about being seen in a way that was different from the way the hunt had seen her, or the feast had seen her. An official way, a permanent way. "I will think about it," she said. "That is not a no," he said. "It is not a no," she agreed. They rode back in the early light without talking much, which was still the easiest thing about being in his company, the ease of silence. For on the morning of the formal court assembly, 2 weeks after the feast, Amara came down to the kennels at her usual time and fed the hounds. She measured each portion the way she always had, careful and steady, because the hounds depended on her, and she did not leave things undone because the day was significant. Gareth stood beside her and watched her work, and said nothing until she was finished. Then he said, "You know what today is?" "Yes," she said. "Are you ready?" She thought about the answer honestly. "I am not sure ready is the right word," she said. "I know what I am doing. I know why I am doing it. The rest is just the doing." Gareth looked at her with the look she had come to understand meant he was holding something too large to say. something that had been accumulating for a long time in the quiet of his chest. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, then let go. "Your father would have been very proud of you," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I have been thinking it for many years, without saying it enough. I am very proud of you." Amara stood very still for a moment. Then she turned and put her arms around him, briefly, because it was not a thing she was practiced at, but it was the right thing, and she felt his hands on her back, and she breathed. Then she stepped back, straightened her jacket, and walked toward the palace. The great hall for the formal assembly was fuller than it had been for the feast. Every house of consequence had sent representatives. The space between the columns was packed with color and ceremony. The full weight of the kingdom's formal structure assembled in one room. Amara entered through the main doors. The noise did not stop, exactly, but it changed. It shifted. The way noise shifts when something unexpected enters a space, and the room adjusts itself around the new fact. People turned. Whispers moved from cluster to cluster. She heard the word Hound from one side of the room, and she did not look toward it. She walked to the center of the hall, and stood where she had stood on the morning of her accusation, in the same position, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. King Zuberi was already seated at the raised platform. He watched her enter, and he did not perform watching. He simply watched, with all of his attention, the way he had watched from the beginning. Then he stood. It was not the expected moment. The assembly had its formal sequence, and a king, standing out of that sequence, was noticed immediately. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned. Zuberi walked down from the platform to the floor, the same walk he had made after the spilled cup, and he came to the center of the hall. He stood in front of Amara. She met his eyes and held them. He reached out and took her hand, not in a ceremonial way, just the way one person takes another person's hand when they are done performing and want to say something directly. Then he looked around the hall, at every face that was looking at him, and he began to speak. He told them the story, not the version that had been circling through the palace corridors with all its convenient edits. The real story, from the moment of the arrow in the tree to the moment of the spilled cup, with every person in their proper place and every action named honestly. He named the tracking she had done in silence for 3 weeks. He named the night in the bush, the channel through the kitchen garden, the 2 days without sleep, the moment she had knocked the cup out of Edrin's hand in front of every lord and lady in the kingdom. And he named the morning she had been thrown out of the palace on false evidence and had walked out without performing grief and had turned directly toward the problem and solved it, because that was the kind of person she was. The hall was very quiet. Then he turned back to her, and he did the thing that would be remembered. He lifted her hand, and he pressed his lips to her forehead. It was the old gesture. Every person in the room old enough to know their history understood it. It was not the formal kiss of ceremony or the polite acknowledgement of service. It was the gesture that the ancient kings of Kavari had used to mark an equal, a companion, someone who stood beside them rather than beneath them or behind them. It had not been used in the living memory of most people in the hall. The silence after it was enormous. Then Zuberi stepped back, still holding her hand, and said to the room at large, "You called her the trained hound. You said it as an insult and meant it to reduce her. But you called her that because she was loyal and skilled and unwavering, and none of those things, in any combination, ever diminished her. They were simply things you chose not to see." He paused. "I see them," he said. "I have always seen them. I was simply not yet brave enough to say so, as clearly as I should have." The room began to find its footing again, slowly, in the way rooms do when something significant has happened, and they need to process it. Lords exchanged looks. Ladies looked at their hands. From the western column, Lord Clarence looked at the ceiling, with an expression that suggested his evening would be spent revising several things he had said in the last several months. Somewhere near the back of the room, a younger lord, barely older than Amara, a man she had never spoken to, and would learn later was named Philip, from the southern province, began to press his hands together. It was a small sound in a large room. Then the lord beside him joined, and the cluster of attendants near the east wall, and the sound built itself gradually, the way good things build themselves, without being forced. Amara stood in it and felt the weight of it, different from the weight she had carried for so long. Not lighter, exactly, just different. like a stone you have been carrying for years and finally set down, and you realize the carrying of it had changed the shape of your hands. She thought about the morning she had been 7 years old, and Gareth had given her a name, and the name had meant steady, and she had spent her whole life being exactly that, without anyone thinking to notice. She thought about the first morning she had fed the hounds before herself, because they depended on her, and she did not leave things undone. She thought about the arrow in the tree, and the cold dirt, and the king asking for her name. She thought about all of it, and she stood in it, and she did not look away. Zuberry was still beside her. He was not looking at the room, he was looking at her. "Is there anything you want to say?" he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. Amara thought about it. She thought about everything she could say, about loyalty and land and the things you learn when nobody is watching you, about the difference between a person who bites strangers and a person who bites its own, about the long and patient and sometimes painful work of being exactly who you are when the world is doing everything in its power to make you into something smaller. She thought about all of it. Then she said, "I would like to go feed the hounds." Zuberry looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a real smile, the kind he wore in the mornings on the Eastern Rise, not the formal kind. "After," he said. "After," she agreed. The assembly continued. The official appointments were made, and Amara's name was among them, spoken into the formal record of Kavari, for the first time, in a room full of people who had mostly never thought to learn it. She heard it without performing anything. She just stood straight and let it be a true thing. Late that afternoon, after the formalities, she went down to the kennels. She measured each portion the way she always had. The old gray hound pressed his head against her knee, and she rested her hand on him. The spotted female near the gate came and went in her usual restless way. The young ones at the back were noisy and needed settling, and she settled them with patient, steady hands. Gareth appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame and watched her work. She did not look up, but she said, "I know you are there." "You always know," he said. "You taught me to know," she said. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "What happens now?" Amara finished the last portion, set down the measure, and looked at the hounds around her, at the clean straw and the full bowls, and the ordinary steady business of care continued in the way that care should always be continued. Not because the day was significant, not because anyone was watching, but because it needed doing, and she was the one who did it. "What happens now is what always happens," she said. "The work." She sat on the bench and the hounds settled around her, and the late sun came through the kennel gate, at the low angle it came through at this hour, the same way it had come through every evening of her life she could remember, and it looked the same as it always had. Only the standing in it was different. She sat there until the light changed, and then she stood up, and she walked toward the palace, and the palace let her in. Not because she was summoned, not because someone gave her permission, because she belonged there, and she had always belonged there, and now the palace simply knew what she had always known. The hounds settled into their evening quiet behind her. The kingdom held its breath, and then, like all breathing things, it let it out. And Amara walked home,